Welcome back, listeners, to another journey into the eerie and unexplained. Tonight, we step beyond the veil of reality and venture into places where the rules of our world no longer apply. These are stories of ordinary people who stumbled upon extraordinary doorways, portals to dimensions they were never meant to see. In this episode, you'll hear about a gas station that leads to a terrifying otherworld, an elevator that opens its doors to impossible floors, a bookstore with stories that trap their readers, and a mask that transports its wearer to a masquerade ball hiding monstrous secrets. So sit back, but don't get too comfortable, because once you step through these portals, there's no turning back. Let's begin. The gas station at mile marker 7. I was so lost in thought, I barely noticed how empty the road had become. Monica's words still echoed in my head, sharp and cutting, the kind of fight you couldn't shake, no matter how far you drove. My hands tightened on the wheel, the low fuel light blinking angrily at me, when I realized two things. I needed gas and something to drink before I lost my mind. That's when I saw it. A flickering neon sign in the distance, its letters spelling out gas in sputtering red light. Relief washed over me like a wave. As I pulled into the station, the oddness of the place hit me immediately. The pumps were ancient, their rusted metal barely holding together, and the building's windows were caked with grime. A hand-painted sign hung crookedly on the door, its bold red letters impossible to miss. Rules: 1. Pay before pumping. 2. Don't use the bathroom. 3. Leave before the clock strikes midnight. I glanced at the car's clock, 11:17 p.m. The thought of being stuck here until morning made my stomach churn. I chuckled nervously, brushing it off as some small-town joke. Still, something about the station felt off. The air hung heavy, damp with the kind of quiet that made your ears strain for a sound that wasn't there. Inside, a man stood behind the counter, watching me with unblinking eyes. His uniform was spotless, but his skin looked wrong, too smooth like the plastic shell of a mannequin. Pump 3, I said, sliding a 20 across the counter. He didn't speak, didn't even nod, just turned to punch the register with mechanical precision. I grabbed a bottle of water from a dusty cooler and set it on the counter. "Do you have a restroom?" I asked without thinking. The man froze. His hand stopped mid-motion, hovering over the cash drawer. Slowly, he raised his head, his gaze locking onto mine with such intensity it felt like a punch to the chest. "Bathroom's out of order?" he said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. The air grew heavier. "Right? No problem," I muttered, backing away. I stepped outside, clutching the water bottle like it was some kind of shield. The air felt even heavier now, thick and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that made me wrinkle my nose. The flickering neon sign cast distorted shadows across the cracked asphalt, and for a moment I thought I saw movement near the edge of the lot. But when I looked again, there was nothing. Just the empty desert stretching into the night. I shook my head, brushing it off as exhaustion and nerves. I unscrewed the bottle and took a long gulp, trying to focus on the task at hand. The pump handle was sticky and cold, the numbers on the ancient display clicking as gas flowed into the car. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like metal dragging against concrete. It came from somewhere behind the building, low and steady, as if someone or something was moving back there. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. No answer. Just the scraping, now joined by a faint clicking noise, irregular and sharp. I told myself to stay put, but my feet had other plans. I crept toward the back of the building, my pulse hammering in my ears. As I rounded the corner, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the shadows, was an old metal door I hadn't noticed before, its paint peeling and rust flaking off in patches. It wasn't on the station's front side or marked on any part of the building I could see. A padlock hung loosely from its handle, the chain swaying as though someone had just been there. A small sign was bolted above it, "Do not enter." I took a step closer, and the air grew colder, biting at my skin despite the desert heat. The faint sounds, the scraping and clicking, had stopped. All that remained was the oppressive silence. Something compelled me to reach for the door, though every part of my brain screamed to leave it alone. My fingers brushed the cold metal handle, and the moment I touched it, the padlock fell away, clattering to the ground. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but pitch-black darkness inside. I hesitated at the threshold, the darkness beyond the door seeming to pulse like a living thing. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn back, to get in my car and drive until the gas tank ran dry. But something about the door called to me, a strange, magnetic pull I couldn't explain. I stepped inside. The air changed immediately, colder and thicker, with a faint hum vibrating through the floor. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, forgetting it was dead. Instead, the faint glow of the gas station sign outside barely illuminated my surroundings. The room was empty, or so I thought. The faint hum grew louder, morphing into an electronic buzz that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I realized the walls weren't made of concrete or wood. They shimmered, moving like liquid metal. Suddenly, a light flared to life above me, casting the room in an eerie, sterile glow. The door slammed shut behind me with a metallic clang, making me jump. I spun around, but the door was gone, replaced by a seamless, featureless wall. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing unnaturally. The floor beneath me began to shift, rippling like waves on a pond. I stumbled, catching myself against one of the walls, which felt warm and alive under my hand. That's when I saw them, faint shapes emerging from the walls, their silhouettes long and distorted, like shadows cast by something that wasn't human. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. One of the shapes moved closer, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as it detached from the wall. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was smooth and featureless, like the man at the counter. But its movements were jagged and insect-like, its limbs clicking as it stepped toward me. "Leave," it said, its voice a guttural whisper that sounded more like static than speech. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned, searching for any sign of an exit, but the room seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction, the walls and floor shifting like they were alive. The figure didn't move closer. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying me. The static-like voice crackled again, more distinct this time. "Why did you come?" "I didn't mean to," I stammered. My voice sounded small in the vast shifting space. "The door, it just opened." "Not for you," it replied, its tone almost disdainful. The buzzing in the walls grew louder, more insistent, as the shadows around me began to solidify. I turned in a frantic circle, searching for anything familiar, when a new shape emerged from the rippling floor. A console of sorts, with a glowing screen that pulsed faintly. On the screen, I saw my car at the gas pump, the camera angle high and unnatural, as if from the ceiling of the gas station. I could see myself stepping out, walking toward the building. Everything I had done since arriving, replayed on a loop. "What is this place?" I whispered. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it gestured toward the console, its elongated hand moving like liquid. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer. The screen flickered, and the image changed. Now I saw something else. Roads I didn't recognize, winding endlessly through a barren gray landscape. The cars driving them were old, rusted, and wrong, their headlights flickering like dying stars. The drivers weren't human. They had the same smooth, featureless faces as the figure before me. "This is where they go," the voice crackled. "The ones who wander too far, the ones who ignore the signs." I swallowed hard. "Signs?" The screen flickered again, showing another image, the rules from the gas station door. "Pay before pumping, don't use the bathroom, leave before midnight." My stomach dropped. "What happens if you break them?" The figure stepped closer, its towering form blotting out the light from the screen. "You become part of the system." "The system?" It reached out, its hand brushing against the console. The screen flickered, showing a new image. Myself, standing behind the counter, wearing the same spotless uniform as the man I'd spoken to earlier. My face was smooth, featureless. My body moved stiffly, like a puppet on strings. "No," I breathed, stepping back. "This is not a place for answers," the figure said, its voice rising above the hum of the walls. "It is a waypoint, A filter. You should not be here. I stumbled back from the console, my legs trembling. The figure loomed over me, its elongated body blending with the shifting walls. I struggled to find words to make sense of what I was seeing. What? What is this place? I managed to choke out. The figure tilted its head again, the static in its voice rising and falling like distorted radio waves. This is a threshold, a station between what you call worlds. Worlds? I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. The screen flickered again, showing glimpses of desolate landscapes, endless highways bathed in red light, towering cities with impossible architecture, forests where the trees seemed to writhe and twist like living creatures. Each scene was brief, a flash of something incomprehensible before shifting to the next. Travelers pass through here, the figure said, its tone emotionless. Those who stray too far, some belong, others do not. The weight of its words pressed down on me like a physical force, and those who don't belong. The screen flickered once more, returning to the image of the man behind the counter. He stood motionless, staring at nothing, his body eerily stiff. My stomach turned as I noticed something I hadn't before. His hands trembled faintly, as if he were trying to move against his will. They serve, the figure said simply. I took a step back, my chest tightening. You're saying he was like me? Once. The shadows around me began to shift again, growing darker and closer. The air vibrated with a low hum that seemed to resonate in my bones. The figure's featureless face leaned closer, its presence overwhelming. Leave, it commanded, the word vibrating through the walls and floor. You do not belong here. How? I asked desperately, spinning around to find the door that had vanished. The door is gone. The figure didn't answer. Instead, the console lit up, displaying the gas station once again. This time, I saw something new, the car clock on the dashboard, its digital numbers flashing 11:59. My heart sank. Midnight was seconds away. You must go, the figure said, its static voice almost urgent now. I turned wildly, searching for an exit. As I did, the hum grew louder, the shadows darker. Something in the air shifted, and I felt a pull. A force dragging me toward the walls. The force dragging me toward the walls grew stronger, and the shadows began to take on shapes, elongated figures with the same smooth, featureless faces as the creature before me. They reached for me, their movements jagged and unnatural, their presence suffocating. I can't leave, I gasped, my voice shaking. There's no way out. The figure before me tilted its head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a moment, everything stilled. The walls stopped shifting, the shadows froze, and even the hum in the air quieted. You are broken, it said, the words crackling like static. I blinked. What? The figure stepped closer, towering over me, its presence both terrifying and strangely calm. This place filters those who wander. It discards the lost, the reckless. It consumes those who defy the rules. But you, your pain is not born of recklessness. It is weight you carry. I opened my mouth to respond, but the creature continued. You do not belong here, not yet. You are tethered to your world, to another's words, another's anger, another's sorrow. It paused, as though struggling to find the right words. Your guilt, your regret, is not fuel for this place. I didn't understand. How could I? But something in its voice, in the way it hesitated, felt almost human. Then let me go, I whispered, desperation leaking into my voice. The figure remained silent for a long moment. Finally, it raised its elongated hand and gestured toward the console. The screen flickered, showing the gas station again. The door I had entered was now visible, its peeling paint bathed in the flickering light of the neon sign. Go, the figure said, but carry this knowledge. Not all who wander find their way back. The pull on my body lessened, the shadows retreating into the walls. My legs felt like lead, but I forced them to move, stumbling toward the door that had reappeared. As I crossed the threshold, the heavy air lifted, and the hum was replaced by the quiet buzz of the neon sign outside. I turned back to look at the door, but it was gone, just a blank wall where it had been. I climbed into my car, shaking, and turned the key. The engine roared to life. The clock on the dashboard read 12, but the gas tank was full, and the road ahead was clear. As I pulled away from the station, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The sign still flickered, its light casting eerie shadows across the lot. But standing beneath it was the man from the counter, staring after me with unblinking, featureless eyes. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove, grateful for the second chance I didn't understand but would never take for granted. The Forgotten Elevator. I hated late nights at the office, but tonight was unavoidable. Deadlines loomed, and my boss's passive-aggressive emails weren't helping. At least the building was quiet after hours. Most of my coworkers were long gone, and the hum of the fluorescent lights was oddly calming. By 11 p.m., I was the only one left. I powered down my computer and grabbed my bag, ready to call it a night. But as I reached the elevator bank, a small laminated sign stopped me in my tracks. Main elevators out of service. Use service elevator at end of hall. The hallway stretched into shadows, the single service elevator barely visible at the far end. Something about it felt wrong. Maybe the way its doors were scratched and dented, or the dim, flickering bulb above it. I'd avoided it for years, thanks to the stories. Every office had them. Urban legends about the weird things that happened in the service elevator. People joked about it skipping floors or getting stuck for hours. Some even claimed it opened onto floors that didn't exist. Ridiculous, I told myself. But tonight, I had no choice. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button. The panel buzzed faintly, the light inside dim as the doors slid open. The space smelled faintly of oil and something metallic. I stepped in and pressed 1 for the lobby. The elevator groaned to life, jerking downward. I gripped the railing as the light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. My stomach dropped with the lurch of the machinery, and then the elevator stopped. The doors opened with a ding. I stepped out and froze. The hallway in front of me was pristine, unnaturally clean. The air was sharp and cold, with a chemical sterility that made me uneasy. The walls were a stark, blinding white, lined with identical doors stretching endlessly in both directions. No signs, no windows, no numbers. Behind me, the elevator doors closed with a finality that made my heart race. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing faintly. No answer. Just the soft hum of the lights above. I turned back to the elevator and hit the call button, but the panel didn't respond. My finger trembled as I pressed it again. Nothing. A faint scratching sound came from one of the doors farther down the hall. It was faint, rhythmic, like nails against glass. I froze, the scratching sound sending a chill down my spine. It was coming from a door about halfway down the hall, identical to all the others. Each step I took toward it felt heavier, my legs reluctant to obey. As I got closer, I noticed something odd about the door. It wasn't entirely closed. A thin sliver of blackness showed through the crack, darker than any shadow I'd ever seen. "Hello?" I called again, my voice barely above a whisper. The scratching stopped. I reached out hesitantly, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something deep inside screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity, or stupidity, pushed me forward. The knob was ice-cold under my palm. I turned it slowly, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. The door swung open, revealing a room that didn't belong in any office building. It was massive, far too large to fit within the structure I knew. The walls were lined with old filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with names I didn't recognize. In the center of the room stood a single desk with a chair, its surface cluttered with papers, photographs, and what looked like medical records. A faint buzzing sound drew my attention to the far wall, where a television flickered on its own. The grainy screen displayed security footage of me. I was standing in the hallway, staring into the camera. "What the?" The screen flickered, and suddenly the camera angle changed. Now it showed me sitting at the desk in the room, my hands rifling through the papers, but I hadn't moved. I was still standing in the doorway, frozen in shock. The scratching sound returned, louder now and coming from the far side of the room. My breath caught as I saw a figure standing in the corner, its back turned to me. Its shape was indistinct, flickering like a bad signal on an old TV. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Slowly it began to turn, the flickering intensifying until its features were unrecognizable, a blur of distorted light and shadow. "I shouldn't be here," I whispered, backing out of the doorway. As I stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The lights above me flickered wildly, and when they steadied, the hallway was no longer empty. The other doors had opened, and figures stood in every doorway, their forms just as flickering and distorted as the one I'd seen in the room. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching me. My chest tightened as I stared at the figures, each one frozen in their doorways, their blurred forms rippling like static. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Instead, forced myself to speak, my voice barely holding steady. "What is this place?" I asked, my words echoing unnaturally down the hallway. For a moment, the figures didn't respond. Then, as one, they tilted their heads, their movements eerily synchronized. The buzzing hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through the walls and floor. "This is where you are measured," one of them said, its voice layered, like multiple people speaking at once. "Measured?" I asked, taking a shaky step back. "Measured for what?" "For truth," the figure replied. Its shape shifted slightly, becoming taller, more defined. The others remained still, and their forms indistinct. "I didn't mean to come here," I stammered. The elevator was out. I didn't know." "You entered," the figure interrupted, its voice cutting through mine. "The choice was made." "I didn't make a choice," I protested, my heart pounding. "I just wanted to go home." The figure stepped forward, the air around it distorting like heat waves. "All who enter this space are brought here for one reason, to face what they have hidden." "What does that even mean?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it gestured toward one of the open doors. My name was written on it, scrawled in black ink across the white surface. I stared at the door, my mouth dry. "What's in there?" The figure didn't respond, but the hum grew louder, almost deafening. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, as if the hallway itself was waiting for me to act. "If you want to leave," the figure said, its voice a low rumble, "you must go inside." I shook my head. "No, I'm not doing this." "Refusal is not an option," the figure replied, stepping aside. The other figures moved in unison, forming a wall behind me, their presence pressing me toward the door. My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob, the metal ice cold under my touch. Slowly I turned it and pushed. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in a dim, shifting light. Shadows flickered along the walls, though there was nothing to cast them. The air felt charged, like static before a storm. I stepped inside cautiously, the floor beneath me feeling unsteady, almost liquid. The walls seemed to move, pulsing in time with an unseen rhythm. At the center of the room was a chair, a simple, wooden chair that looked out of place amidst the shifting chaos. Resting on the chair was a single object, a key. "What is this?" I whispered, stepping closer. The key shimmered faintly, catching the strange, sourceless light in the room. I reached for it, but the moment my fingers brushed the metal, the walls erupted in motion. Images flashed across the surfaces, blurry and fragmented, as if I were seeing snapshots of lives that weren't mine. A woman running through a forest, her face twisted in terror. A child sitting alone in an empty room, their head bowed. A man standing on a ledge, staring down into a void. The images flickered faster, blending into each other, until the walls stilled, settling on one image. Me, standing in this very room, holding the key. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The version of me in the image turned its head, its face blank and featureless, yet it was unmistakably me. "You don't belong here," a voice said, echoing through the room. I turned sharply, but no one was there. The voice came again, layered and hollow. "This is not your story." The room began to ripple, the walls folding in on themselves, the floor beneath me dissolving into nothingness. I felt myself falling, the key clutched tightly in my hand, the voice growing louder as it echoed around me. "This is not your story. Leave." The fall stopped abruptly, and I found myself standing in the hallway again. The key was gone. The door I had entered now sealed and featureless like the others. I stared at the now sealed door, my breath shallow and ragged. The hallway was silent again, the figures that had once stood in the doorways gone. But the key in my hand felt heavier now, its cold metal pressing against my palm. The elevator was just ahead, its doors open, waiting for me. I stumbled toward it, clutching the key tightly, as though it might vanish if I loosened my grip. I stepped inside, and the doors closed with a soft hiss. The panel had changed. Instead of numbered floors, there was only a single slot in the center. A small, narrow opening shaped exactly like the key. I hesitated, my pulse hammering in my ears. The whispers I'd heard earlier returned, faint and indistinct, swirling around me like a distant wind. I slid the key into the slot, and the elevator jerked to life. The walls began to glow faintly, displaying strange symbols and shifting images. I saw glimpses of places that defied logic. A city suspended in the sky, a vast ocean of stars, and a barren wasteland under a blood-red sky. Then the elevator stopped. The doors slid open to reveal a circular room, its walls lined with intricate carvings that pulsed with faint light. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat a book, bound in what looked like black leather. The key in the elevator panel dislodged itself and floated toward the pedestal, clicking into a lock at the book's side. I stepped forward, drawn to the book, despite the growing sense of unease gnawing at my chest. As I reached the pedestal, words began to appear on the cover of the book, glowing faintly, the stories of those who came before. I opened it, my hands trembling. Inside were names, hundreds of them, each accompanied by a short description. Maria H. entered on floor 6, failed to retrieve the key, remains trapped. Jeremy T. entered on floor 3, refused to choose, consumed by the void. Diana L. entered on floor 10, retrieved the key but broke the rules, became a guide. I turned the page and froze. My name was there. Your name entered on floor 1, retrieved the key, awaiting choice. My stomach dropped as the words beneath my name began to shift, rearranging themselves into a question. Do you leave, or do you take your place? The pedestal began to glow, and a door appeared on the far side of the room. It pulsed faintly, inviting me to step through. I turned back to the book, my hands trembling. The elevator was gone, replaced by a figure standing silently in its place. It was one of the flickering beings I had seen before, but this one was more defined, its form eerily human. You have a choice, it said, its voice hollow and echoing. The key opens the way. Stay and you will guide others. Leave and your story ends here. What happens if I stay? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You become part of the system, it replied. A watcher, a guide, a keeper of the threshold. And if I leave? The figure didn't answer, but the door on the far wall began to pulse more brightly, the air around it shimmering. I stood frozen, the key now glowing faintly in the pedestal. The figure, its form flickering like a glitch in a video, tilted its head as if studying me. What does it mean to be a keeper of the threshold? I asked, my voice shaky. The figure's hollow eyes didn't blink. To guide, to maintain balance. This place exists between worlds, a crossing where lost souls come to face themselves. The key opens doors to what they must see, what they fear, what they hide, what they refuse to accept. I glanced at the book, my name glowing faintly on its page. And the ones who don't succeed? What happens to them? They remain here, the figure replied, its voice even and detached. Some are consumed, others become part of the threshold itself, echoes, fragments of what they were. You have encountered them already. My stomach churned as I thought of the shadowy figures in the hallway, their indistinct forms watching me in silence. And the ones who guide? I asked. They choose to stay, the figure said, to ensure others face their truths, to hold the key and guard the door. Without them, the threshold would collapse, and those trapped would be lost forever. I looked back at the glowing door, its light casting long shadows across the room. If I leave, what happens to this place? It will continue, the figure said simply. Another will be chosen. My hands clenched into fists. The weight of the choice pressed down on me, heavier than anything I had ever carried. Stay and take on a role I couldn't fully understand, or leave and return to my life, carrying the scars of what I'd seen. The figure stepped aside, gesturing toward the glowing door. "Choose," it said. I took a shaky breath and approached the pedestal, my fingers brushing the key. It was warm now, pulsing faintly with an energy that felt alive. My mind raced with everything I had seen, every memory and fear that had been laid bare in this place. "I've spent my whole life running," I said softly, more to myself than the figure. "For my mistakes, for my regrets. Maybe it's time I stop." The figure didn't respond, but the air around it seemed to ripple in acknowledgement. I turned, gripping the key tightly, and walked toward the glowing door. The light grew brighter as I approached, enveloping me in its warmth. I stepped through, the world dissolving into white, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. The bookstore that wasn't there yesterday. The bookstore wasn't there yesterday. I was sure of it. I walked this route every day, past the same empty storefronts and the same tired cafe where I nursed my overpriced coffee while staring at my blank laptop screen. But today, nestled between a boarded-up thrift store and a laundromat, was a place I'd never seen before. The sign above the door read, "The Final Chapter." The windows were dark, their surfaces fogged with condensation, and a hand-painted sign hung crookedly in the glass. "Enter, but do not open a book unless you are ready to live its story." I hesitated. My instinct was to keep walking, but curiosity and, let's be honest, desperation got the better of me. I hadn't written a word in weeks, and the thought of stumbling upon something inspiring was enough to pull me inside. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and something faintly sweet, like vanilla. The shelves stretched impossibly high, filled with books of every size and color. A warm golden light illuminated the room, though I couldn't see its source. "Hello?" I called, my voice swallowed by the quiet. No answer. The store seemed empty, but it didn't feel abandoned. Something about it was alive, not in the literal sense, but as if the space was watching, waiting. I wandered between the shelves, running my fingers along the spines. None of the books had titles, just blank covers that felt oddly warm to the touch. My fingers tingled as I lingered on one, a small, black leather-bound volume that practically hummed beneath my fingertips. I picked it up, ignoring the strange feeling that crept up my arm as I opened it. The pages were blank at first, but as I turned them, words began to appear, as though written by an invisible hand. "This is the story of someone who forgot how to dream." I froze, my chest tightening. The words seemed to sink into me, pulling at something buried deep inside. I flipped to the next page. They lived in a world where creativity was stolen, piece by piece, until nothing remained. The room seemed to dim, the golden light fading as the words on the page twisted and shifted. The edges of the book glowed faintly, and a soft hum filled the air. And then the floor beneath me gave way. I fell, but not in the way you'd expect. There was no rush of air, no sensation of gravity pulling me down. It was more like being unmoored, floating through a void of shifting colors and muted whispers. When I landed, it wasn't on the creaky wooden floor of the bookstore. It was on cracked pavement under a sky that looked like it had been painted with ash. Towering structures loomed around me, their surfaces smooth and reflective, like enormous shards of glass piercing the ground. The city stretched endlessly, its streets deserted and eerily silent. The book was still in my hands, its cover glowing faintly. Words appeared on the page again. "This is the world of the forgotten, those who dreamed but never acted, those who created but never shared." I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding. This wasn't real, it couldn't be. I spun around, searching for some way out, but the streets all looked the same, twisting and merging into an endless labyrinth. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing against the towering glass structures. A faint sound answered, a shuffle like footsteps on gravel. I turned sharply, clutching the book to my chest. A figure emerged from the shadows, its shape indistinct at first. As it stepped into the dim light, I realized it wasn't quite human. Its face was smooth and featureless, like a blank canvas, and its movements were slow and deliberate. It carried a book, identical to mine, its cover glowing faintly in its hands. "Who are you?" I asked, backing away. The figure tilted its head, as though considering the question. Then it held out the book, opening it to reveal words scrawled in glowing ink. "You've entered the story. Now you must finish it." "What do you mean? Finish it?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "I didn't ask to be here." The figure didn't speak. It simply pointed to my book, the glowing ink on its cover pulsing faintly. The words inside were shifting again, rearranging themselves into something new. I hesitated, then slowly opened it. "To leave, you must write your way out. But beware, the world takes what you give it." I stared at the page, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Write my way out? What does that even mean?" The figure stepped closer, its blank face reflecting the dull light of the sky. Its book shimmered, and words appeared. "The more you give, the more it takes." Suddenly the ground beneath my feet trembled. Cracks spiderwebbed across the pavement, glowing with a faint, eerie light. The buildings around me began to ripple, their glass-like surfaces twisting into unfamiliar shapes. "What's happening?" I shouted, clutching the book tightly. The figure pointed again, its movements slow and deliberate. I looked down at the book in my hands. The blank pages stared back at me, waiting. "I don't know what to write," I yelled, panic creeping into my voice. The figure's book glowed brighter, the words inside rearranging themselves, one final time. "You already know." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. Images flooded my mind, unfinished stories, half-formed ideas I'd abandoned over the years. Characters without endings, worlds without purpose. I opened my eyes and pressed the pen from my pocket to the page, the ink flowing like liquid light as I began to write. The world was empty no longer. The ground beneath me steadied, the cracks sealing themselves as the city's oppressive silence gave way to faint whispers. Shapes began to form around me. People, objects, streets that seemed real but incomplete, like sketches waiting to be colored. But as I wrote, I felt it. A pull, sharp and insistent, tugging at something deep inside me. The book wasn't just taking my words, it was taking my memories. Each sentence I wrote grew harder, pieces of my past slipping away like sand through my fingers. My first bike, my childhood dog, Gabriella's laugh. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Not that, please." But the book didn't care. It demanded more. The figure stepped closer, its form shimmering and shifting as though it were part of the world I was creating. It held out its book again, and I saw a single word glowing on its page. "Decide." I looked down at my own book, its pages now filled with glowing text, a story I didn't even recognize. The city around me was alive now, bustling with people who didn't notice me, who couldn't see the cracks in their world. I had a choice: finish the story and lose myself completely, or leave it unfinished and remain trapped here forever. I gripped the pen tighter, my hands shaking. The city around me buzzed with energy, its people and places vibrant and alive, but the pull inside me was relentless. Every word I wrote felt like tearing a piece of myself away. But I knew the truth. If I didn't finish the story, this place would hold me forever. I took a deep, shuddering breath and put the pen to the page again. The writers stood at the heart of the city, their words shaping the world, their sacrifice binding it together. The ground trembled as the glowing cracks returned, this time reaching upward to the sky. The buildings warped and shimmered, their forms settling into something solid. The whispers in the air grew louder, like 1,000 voices calling out in unison. The figure stepped closer, its faceless head tilting as though observing my every move. Its book glowed brighter, and I realized it was mirroring my own, each word I wrote appearing in its pages. I kept writing, even as the pull grew stronger, erasing pieces of me with every sentence. My favorite song vanished from my memory. The face of my best friend blurred, then disappeared entirely. The fight with Gabriella that had haunted me was gone, and with it, the sound of her voice. But the city, this world was complete. The streets gleamed with life. People laughed and shouted, their faces bright with purpose. The oppressive sky softened, glowing with the faint warmth of an imagined sun. I wrote the final words, my hand trembling. And with the last stroke of the pen, the world was whole. The book snapped shut, the light from its pages extinguishing in an instant. I staggered back, the pen slipping from my grasp. The figure stood before me, its form more solid now, almost human. It held the book reverently, nodding as if in approval. "You are done," it said, its voice soft now, almost kind. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. My mind felt empty, hollow. I couldn't remember why I was here, or even who I was. The figure stepped aside and I saw the bookstore door behind it, standing open. A warm light spilled through, beckoning me forward. I took one last look at the city I had created, its beauty and life resonating with an emotion I couldn't name. Then I stepped through the door. Lights inside were out. I found myself back on the street, standing in front of the storefront. The sign above the door still read the final chapter, but the lights inside were out. When I reached for the handle, my hand passed through it like smoke. I turned and walked away, my steps slow and aimless. I felt lighter, but not in a comforting way. There was a hollowness inside me, a void where something important used to be. As I passed the cafe, I glanced at the laptop on a nearby table. The blank screen felt oddly familiar, like something I'd once known but could no longer remember. The bookstore had taken what it needed, and now I was left with the emptiness it had filled. The Mask That Speaks. The mask arrived with the rest of the estate sale shipment. Dozens of dusty costumes and faded props from a theater that had been shuttered for decades. I'd seen my share of strange inventory running the shop, but this mask was different. It was made of black and gold lacquer, its surface intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to shimmer when the light hit them just right. The hollow eyes stared at me, their emptiness unsettling. A small tag hung from the strap, the words written in looping script, "Do not wear after midnight." I laughed to myself, setting it aside. It was a theater prop, after all. The tag was probably just part of some long-forgotten production. But as the day went on, I couldn't stop glancing at it. The mask seemed to call to me, its strange patterns catching my eye no matter where I moved in the shop. By the time I locked up for the night, it was past 11. I sat behind the counter, scrolling aimlessly on my phone. The mask was still there, perched on the display stand like it was waiting for something. "It's just a mask," I muttered, picking it up. The lacquer was cool and smooth under my fingers, almost unnaturally so. The clock on the wall ticked softly, 11:59. 12. The clock struck midnight, just as I slipped the mask over my face. The moment it settled, a chill ran down my spine, sharp and sudden, like I'd stepped into a freezer. The shop around me wavered, the edges of my vision blurring until everything dissolved into darkness. I tried to pull the mask off, but it wouldn't budge. My hands met resistance, as if it had fused to my skin. Panic bubbled in my chest, but before I could scream, the darkness around me shifted. The air changed. It was warm now, heavy with the scent of candle wax and something sweet like decaying flowers. My vision cleared, and I found myself in a grand ballroom, the likes of which I'd only seen in old paintings. The room was massive, with gilded walls and towering arches that seemed to stretch into infinity. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their flickering light casting long, dancing shadows. The floor was polished marble, its surface reflecting the figures that moved gracefully across it. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary masquerade ball. The guests were dressed in elaborate gowns and tailored suits, each adorned with masks more intricate than the last. But something about them was wrong. Their movements were too smooth, too synchronized, like puppets pulled by invisible strings. and their masks, while beautiful, seemed to shift subtly as I stared, the patterns twisting and writhing like living things. "Welcome," a voice said behind me, smooth and elegant. I turned sharply to find a figure towering over me, draped in deep red robes. Their mask was unlike the others, its surface blank and featureless except for a wide, unnatural smile carved into the lacquer. "You're just in time," they said, their voice echoing slightly. "The festivities are about to begin." The figure gestured for me to follow, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they were savoring the moment. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet betrayed me, stepping forward as if compelled by an unseen force. The room was alive with motion, the masked guests swirling across the floor in intricate patterns. Their laughter, soft and melodic, echoed faintly, but it felt hollow. It didn't match the way they moved, as if the sound was coming from somewhere else entirely. As I followed the figure, I noticed the details. The way the guests' masks shimmered and warped when I looked too closely. One mask appeared to have delicate floral patterns etched into it, but when the wearer turned, the flowers twisted into snarling mouths. Another mask resembled a serene face, but its lips seemed to part slightly, revealing jagged teeth that vanished when I blinked. The figure in red robes led me to the edge of the ballroom, where a long table stretched endlessly, covered in ornate platters of food. My stomach twisted at the sight. The food looked exquisite. Roast meats glistening with juices, fruits that sparkled like jewels, cakes piled high with rich frosting. But the longer I stared, the more I noticed the details. A fruit split open to reveal something writhing inside. A cut of meat bled fresh, crimson liquid that dripped onto the table. I turned away, bile rising in my throat. "Please, enjoy the feast," the figure said, their featureless mask tilting toward me. "I'm not hungry," I said quickly, taking a step back. The figure chuckled softly, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Suit yourself. But one must partake before the night ends." Before I could respond, the music changed. The soft melody shifted into something darker, the rhythm discordant, pulling at the edges of my sanity. The guests turned their attention to the center of the room, where a grand staircase descended into the ballroom. From the shadows emerged another figure, their mask far more elaborate than any I had seen. It was crafted from what looked like bone and gold, with horns curling upward and empty sockets where eyes should have been. "Ah, the host arrives," my guide murmured, their tone reverent. The room fell silent as the horned figure descended the stairs, their presence commanding and suffocating. I felt their gaze, though their mask had no eyes, and it pinned me in place, as if they knew exactly who I was and why I was here. The host descended the stairs slowly, their gilded horns glinting in the flickering candlelight. The crowd of masked guests parted in perfect unison, creating a path for the figure as they glided across the ballroom floor. Every movement they made was deliberate, precise, and hauntingly elegant. I used the moment of distraction to step away from the figure in red robes, blending into the edges of the crowd. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, searching for anything that resembled an exit. But the walls weren't just walls. They were mirrors, massive and seamless, reflecting the ballroom in every detail. Except the reflections didn't match. I froze, staring at the nearest mirror. While the real ballroom was filled with graceful dancers and candlelit splendor, the reflection showed something else entirely. The masked guests in the mirror weren't dancing, they were writhing, their limbs twisted at impossible angles. Their masks had fused with their faces, the ornate designs grotesquely warped. The grand feast on the mirrored table was rotten, swarming with insects. I took a step back, my stomach churning, and nearly stumbled into another guest. "Sorry," I muttered, but they didn't respond. Their head turned slowly toward me, and beneath their mask, I glimpsed something. Moving. A ripple ran through the air, and the music shifted again, growing deeper and slower like a heartbeat. The candles flickered, their flames dimming. "Partake before the night ends." The words echoed in my mind, though no one had spoken them. My gaze drifted back to the mirrored wall. The reflection of myself was there, but my mask was wrong. Its patterns twisted and writhed, forming a shape that seemed alive. I spun away, my pulse hammering, and caught sight of a small, shadowed doorway at the far end of the ballroom. It was the first thing I'd seen that wasn't gilded or glowing. Something about it felt different. The doorway beckoned, but the air around me seemed heavier with each step I took toward it. The masked guests turned their heads slowly, as if sensing my movements. The host paused mid-stride, their horned mask tilting slightly as they scanned the room. Their gaze, or whatever force their mask projected, swept over the crowd, and I froze. In the mirrors, their reflection wasn't looking at the guests. It was staring straight at me. My breath quickened as I edged closer to the shadowed doorway, the oppressive air pressing against me like invisible hands. The host's movements slowed, their horned mask tilting slightly as though they could sense my intent. The masked guests, still eerily silent, began to shift subtly, their heads turning toward me one by one. I forced myself to move faster, weaving through the crowd as gracefully as I could manage. The doorway was closer now, its shadowed frame standing out against the golden opulence of the ballroom. It felt like a tear in the fabric of this place, a sliver of reality trying to break through. "Do not leave," the voice rang out, deep and commanding, though the host's mask didn't move. It echoed through the ballroom, stopping me in my tracks. For a moment, the crowd fell utterly still. Then, like puppets pulled by invisible strings, they turned toward me as one. The music stopped, the candlelight dimmed. I broke into a run. The doorway loomed ahead, and I threw myself through it, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was cool, damp, and smelled faintly of earth and stone. I stumbled into a narrow hallway, the ornate opulence of the ballroom replaced by rough, gray walls lit by a faint, flickering light. The sound of my ragged breathing filled the space, but as I turned back, I realized the doorway was gone. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My hands shook as I reached for the mask, desperate to pull it off. But the moment my fingers touched its surface, a voice whispered, low and taunting, "You think you've escaped?" The hallway around me began to shift. The walls twisted, elongating unnaturally, and the flickering light grew dimmer. I stumbled forward, every step feeling heavier than the last. The end of the hallway was marked by another door, plain, wooden, and far too ordinary for the strangeness of this place. It bore a single message carved into the surface: "Speak the truth, or be lost forever." I felt uneasy as I pushed it open, stepping into yet another room. This one was small, dimly lit, and utterly silent. At its center stood a mirror, its surface rippling faintly like water. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't me. The figure in the mirror wore the same mask, but their eyes were visible now. My eyes, but hollow, sunken, and void of life. The mirror's surface began to move, the reflection stepping closer, pressing its hand against the glass. I froze, unable to look away. "You wore the mask," it said, its voice my own but layered with something deeper, something ancient. "Now, will you become it?" I stared at the reflection, its hollow eyes piercing into me. My chest tightened, panic clawing at my thoughts. But something about its words stuck in my mind. "You wore the mask. Now, will you become it?" It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge. My gaze dropped to the mask's patterns, their swirling shapes more alive than ever. They pulsed and twisted like tendrils trying to burrow into my mind. I could feel it now. The mask wasn't just on me, it was in me. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I won't let you take me." The reflection tilted its head, its empty eyes narrowing. "You already did." The room shifted again, the mirror rippling violently as the walls began to close in. The air grew thick, pressing against my lungs, but I forced myself to stay calm. If this thing wanted me to believe I was trapped, then I had to do the opposite. The mask thrived on fear, on surrender. I took a step closer to the mirror, my hand trembling as I reached toward it. The reflection mimicked my movements, but its mask twisted grotesquely, the patterns coiling into something monstrous. "You think you can resist?" it hissed, its voice warping into something jagged and cruel. "Yes," I said, louder this time. The mirror's surface shuddered, the reflection growing darker, more distorted. The mask's patterns flared violently and pain shot through my head, but I held my ground. "You are nothing without me," the reflection spat. "You're just another forgotten face." "That's where you're wrong," I said. My voice steadied, the words rising from somewhere deep inside me. "I don't need the mask. I never did." The reflection froze, its form flickering like a disrupted signal. For the first time, I saw hesitation, cracks in its smooth, perfect facade. I grabbed the edges of the mask, and this time it gave way. It fought me, its tendrils writhing and lashing out, but I kept pulling, the pain searing through my skull. As I tore it free, the room erupted in light, blinding and pure. The mirror shattered, its shards dissolving into nothingness. I woke up on the floor of the costume shop, the mask lying next to me, lifeless and dull. Its patterns were gone, replaced by a blank, featureless surface. I stared at it, my chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The shop was silent, just as I'd left it, but something had changed. I wasn't afraid anymore. I grabbed the mask and carried it to the back room, where the rest of the estate sale inventory was stored. Without hesitation, I locked it in a trunk and shoved it into the farthest corner, covering it with boxes. It didn't belong to me. It never did. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of myself in the shop's mirror. My face was pale, my eyes tired, but they were my own. For now, that was enough. Tonight we open doors to the unknown, stepping through dimensions where the rules of reality falter and the familiar twists into the inexplicable. A gas station that defies the map, an elevator with no end, a mask that hides more than it reveals. Each a portal to somewhere else, but always leading to the same destination. Mystery. As we close these portals, remember, the lines between worlds are thinner than you think. A wrong turn, a curious glance, and you too may find yourself on the other side. Don't forget to subscribe, because there are always more mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and beware of what lies just beyond the light.